Welcome to Democracy Explained, a podcast by Apathy is Boring. In this series, we explore the pillars that hold up our democracy: participation, information, pluralism, rights, and elections. I'm Sam Roosh, Executive Director at Apathy is Boring, and your host of Democracy Explained.
Hi, I'm Sid, one of the co-hosts of Democracy Explained. In today's episode, we ask, what does it mean to truly live together?
All of our societies are diverse. They're diverse in different ways. We're diverse geographically, ethnically, gender, generation, linguistically, religiously, so many different factors. And every society is diverse in different ways. My name is Meredith Preston McGee, and I currently serve as the Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism. Obviously, I don't think there is a single model of pluralism anywhere in the world. We often say diversity is the thing, pluralism is the action. But pluralism really refers to the actions and the choices that we take as societies to lean into those into that diversity and into those differences, and recognize that if we connect with all of those, we come out stronger as societies, rather than seeing these things as threats, as something that needs to be flattened out, something that needs to be suppressed in different ways. If we're able to lean into that and make active choices as a society, we'll be stronger together.
Hold up. Before we continue this conversation with Meredith, let's just define pluralism real quick. Pluralism essentially means different people with different backgrounds, beliefs, and ideas living and working together with respect. In a democracy, it's about making sure everyone's voice can be heard and included, not just the majority. It's what keeps our communities open, fair, and strong. Now, back to the conversation.
So diversity is an important component to it, but it isn't, in fact, the thing. I would say, though, tolerance is an interesting one as well, because often we will tolerate one another's differences, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we celebrate them or we seek to learn from them. So we're really asking people to be a little bit more, maybe a little bit more active, a little bit more proactive than tolerance would suggest.
So is that like something along the lines of like acceptance, or are you use the word celebration? Like, is it really like celebrating our differences and leaning into that aspect of it? That's sort of the action piece that you're talking about?
Yeah, and I think we like to think about it in the positive. I think that's really important. And so celebrating and embracing difference is really key. But at the same time, I don't think we're naive at all to the fact that diverse societies are hard. And actually getting everyone to feel that they can be equal members of a society when they have very, very different expectations of that society, different needs, and so forth, is really difficult. And so we need deliberate strategies so that we can listen to all of those voices and connect with that, and then have the tough conversations, because often our differences do bump up against one another. But if we come at that with a positive conviction that our diversity is a good thing, we just need to figure out how we do that well, then we're solutions driven rather than driven, quite frankly, by fear. And when we think about belonging, which is really at the core, I think, of pluralism anywhere in the world, it's that question of, what does it actually mean for me to belong in society? For me to feel truly Canadian? What does that mean? But then the second piece of that is, how much do you see me as being Canadian? And how Canadian do I see you? So what's the reciprocity in our relationship with one another? But then there's a third piece, which I think has been particularly eroded in recent years, is this sense of, how much agency do I feel I have over the direction the society is going? And how am I navigating that with people that think differently from me? And am I navigating that with this kind of respect and recognition of one another's value in society? And that's hard, right? Like, that requires a lot of all of us all the time.
What, from your perspective, Meredith, is it that's eroding that third piece on agency?
Yeah, I think it's really important for us to explore all of the nuances of what's chipping away at it. We love to blame social media. I love to blame social media. We all do. I think that there is some truth to that. I think that in the information age that we're in, the way that social media has developed is keeping us apart. And I would say I was doing some reading recently about 2004, which was sort of when His Late Highness the Aga Khan gave a really phenomenal lecture on pluralism in Toronto, sort of the beginning of the GCP. And it was the same year that Facebook and Gmail launched. Feels like a lifetime ago. It was 21 years ago. But what you saw was the shift from Facebook being something that was an actual connecting network of humans behind the screen to something that is algorithmically driven, that is increasingly overlaid with AI to a point that we're not sure we can trust what we see, and is so siloed as to completely disconnect us from any information or ideas that really challenge the way that we think. And that is, I think, having a structural impact, not just on our social fabric, but on how our brains are computing information, how we're figuring out how to live with the complexity of ideas, not a binary or not even a singularity, but actually something that is more complicated. So the second thing that I would say, and is that I do think we don't have enough spaces in our own society, and definitely post COVID, but probably also before, where we have tough conversations with a foundation that the conversation is going to be hard, but it is going to be respectful, and it is designed for us to understand one another better and come to some sort of solution.
We all have that like universal interest, which is to be heard and which is to have that capacity to deliberate in the first place. Hi, my name is Russell Clark. Currently, I'm a grad student at Toronto Metropolitan University in the Department of Philosophy, but I also hold a bachelor's in politics and governance and a master's in political theory from the London School of Economics. Part of how I have my grievances or my value systems heard is that I'm actually able to express it in speech, whether that's in like a overtly political arena or just in everyday conversations with people. There's various levels at which this recognition and this like disclosure of our values and our interests actually play out, and none of them are less valuable than the other. They all sort of build off one another.
Absolutely. And hearing that makes me wonder, how has our idea of pluralism evolved over time?
We are living in a time of real scarcity. And I think a lot of the messages that come out say in moments of scarcity, you have to really protect what you have and not be generous to the other. But when you look historically at places where we have actually come through times of scarcity and times of conflict and times of threat, the things that have worked is actually cooperation. It's cooperation across difference. Indigenous leaders that we speak to in Canada remind us this all the time, that in moments of scarcity, cooperation and collaboration is what got them through, not these kinds of divisive moments. So I think we really have to cut through that noise and recognize that we have to find these spaces for collaboration.
In every campaign I've ever built that's been successful, it's been around working with unlikely allies. I'm Amanda Sussman. I've been working in advocacy for about 20 years now. I started on the receiving end of advocacy in 2 different federal ministers' offices during the Chrétien years. And for 20 years, I've been working with coalitions of human rights organizations and others on major campaigns to change policy in Canada and globally.
You recently participated in a short film called Crossing the Divide, where you went to a Braver Angels conference. What got you to take that step, and why at this moment did you decide to participate in that kind of activity?
For our listeners, the film we're talking about, Crossing the Divide, is about 2 Canadians, one liberal and one conservative, who attended an American conference called Braver Angels, focused on gathering people from diverse political backgrounds to depolarize the nation and essentially build bridges across political divides. Amanda was one of those Canadians.
Well, I think, like many people, I'm really concerned about the disintegration of democratic culture. The recent elections we've seen globally, there's a different tone to recognizing that democracy is, in fact, about diversity of opinion. And when you start to hear people referring to others on the other side as traitors, And also looking around, it's ripping families apart. Friends of mine aren't going home for Thanksgiving. Around the dinner table, it's politics is off the table in so many forums where it actually could and should be a vibrant discussion. So I'm seriously concerned about a disintegration to the point of violence, where we think the other side are crazy, we think the other side are traitors. And I looked around and I said, I don't really have any friends who disagree with me. And what kind of bubble am I living in? And I found this organization, Braver Angels, and they pair you one to one with someone on the other side of the political divide. And that could be in many ways politically, if you're a red or a blue. It could also be rural urban. It could be Israel Gaza. It could be generational. And they give you guidelines and a way in to start having those discussions. So next thing I know, I ask a person who is on the complete the other extreme, where I am politically, to jump in the car with me and take an 11-hour road trip. We didn't know each other at all. And we talked abortion, we talked immigration, we talked all the hot button political issues, and became friends in the process. So it was an incredible experience and a real growing opportunity. I learned a lot.
Where do you think that's coming from, that we're not seeing as pluralistic conditions as we probably should be in places like the House of Commons, in some instances, in elections focused debates? Where is that coming from, and why are we moving in that direction?
Institutions are built by people, but institutions shape people. And so when you think about our systems of governance, the behavior of our government, our laws and policies, and how government is applying those, that will really shape how people are able to engage in these kinds of discussions that we're talking about. But at the same time, our own sort of norms and narratives, what we often think about as pluralism software, how we're engaging with one another, whether it's in an online space or in a real human space, really shapes how government behaves, how laws and policies are developed, and how those are applied, because they're applied by human beings. And so, again, we have to get back to this idea that this is actually an all of society effort. And I worry that we're in a moment of such anxiety and division that there's a tendency to say, this is your responsibility. You have to do this for me. Rather than all of us collectively leaning in and saying, this is hard. Let's figure out what each of us can do in our own spaces.
Our democracy is not just about diversity of identity, but diversity of opinion as well. And over the years, I have such respect for the fact that we need that diversity of opinion to get good decisions and get good policy.
Everything is a negotiation and a navigation. And so some things will be up for negotiation. When the South African constitution was being developed, they had a massive and really, really phenomenal consultation process across the entire country. And I worked at one point with the chair of the Constitutional Commission on another program in Sudan. And he used to reflect that part of the purpose of that was not so that every South African could get their way in what the Constitution was going to look like, but that the process of consulting them enabled people to raise issues, so that if somebody in a community said, I want the Quran to be the Constitution of South Africa, that they had every right to raise that. It wasn't going to be what the Constitution of South Africa came out with. It wasn't going to be what the Bill of Rights that developed was going to be, but that he had the right to raise that and to have a conversation about that, and to try to unpick what within the Quran did get reflected in the Constitution in terms of the spirit and the ideas. And when you were able to do that, you were able for people to say, I didn't get my way, but I respect the process. And so I do respect that certain things will be within the boundaries of this shared society, and other things we have to navigate and negotiate.
When you can go to a decision maker and say, we have this broad spectrum of organizations, of citizens with different points of view from different walks of life who are sharing this same goal, it's a really strong case for that decision maker to say yes.
But we can only do that if we all recognize our own responsibilities to one another within that social space. And so you have to think about laws and policies and how they're applied. But I also think you have to think, therefore, about how young people are being taught about what our governance system is so that they have an understanding and an ability to engage as fully formed citizens. So that you're not just taking a 10-second meme off TikTok and saying, well, this person in the House of Commons said X, and therefore I think Y, but really saying, well, how does legislation develop? How does it happen in my municipality if I'm unhappy with the way something's going? How do I actually understand these different systems of governance and my responsibilities and rights as a citizen to engage in them? So I do think that there's a huge piece that the education system needs to play to make our young people citizens to really understand and shape that system going forward.
I feel like there is a lot of anger that's been produced. What do we do with that rage? How can we transform it? Where do we give people the space to back out of it or to let it dissipate? To your point, there was the question around, like hearing someone's backstory, has that impact on people, right? It's sort of like throws water on the flames, but like what else do you think we can do with this sort of more generally?
What's under rage is fear, right? There's a fear. So one is, yes, people need to be heard. And just that question, why are you so angry? Tell me how you got that angry. And then I can understand how you feel. But I back up a bit because we focus again on those people who are lost, about to go into the school and fire the gun. We are in a preventative stage now. There's many people who aren't at that extreme point yet, and that's where the real work is. And if we can tap into those questions work well when you're on the journey, right, to that point. It can really take the temperature down and create that space. And once people feel heard, I've found that even in that situation, 85% of the people get to a place where you can have a conversation, and really that temperature just comes down. So if we only focus on the people on the very edge of the cliff, it seems intractable. But especially in Canada, we have time, but the time is now.
I think that the tenor in among political leaders is something that troubles me greatly. And I did have a conversation with legislators maybe a year and a half ago, and I was talking about the issues of pluralism. I was talking about them specifically in relation to Gaza and Israel Palestine and the very, very, very divisive conversations that are being had in societies around the world. And I said, you do need to lean into constructive discussions. And one of the legislators commented and they said, our systems don't encourage us to do that. Our systems encourage us to get a dig in, to win the conversation, to win the point for fundraising, for profile, and so forth. And so I do think that there needs to be more pressure on political leaders, certainly, to lean into constructive conversations and to lead by example. But they are not the only leaders in our society. Media, private sector, faith leaders, community leaders, civil society leaders, there's so many different spaces where we can be modeling this kind of behavior better, right? We shouldn't just be looking to government to be fixing it.
We stopped being extremely political and we sort of like relegated ourselves as the people to our private life. And we said, okay, here, you guys are the adults, you guys are the technocrats, you know everything. Make sure that our lives get at least incrementally better over time. They failed to deliver that, unfortunately. And now people are rightfully angry, and they're taking that anger out, I want to say, in the form of this like very aggressive polarization. Now it's my way or the highway. If I'm on the left, I need to embrace like aggressively leftist policies. If I'm on the right, I need to express aggressively conservative policies. And you don't need to be heard out, or you don't need to have a stake in this at all if you're on the opposite side, because you're just like wrong.
But when we were talking about kind of bigger institutional systems, I did like going back to education systems, because I think when we think about government, we often think about maybe the federal government or the provincial government, but our school institutions are governmental systems that are really shaping young people's minds. And one of our awardees many years ago is called Learning History That Is Not Yet History, and they're a network of history educators across the Balkans, and they were all looking at the curricula that they were having to teach in Serbia or Bosnia or Kosovo, and looking at it and saying, these are nationalistic narratives that are setting our young people up to hate their neighbors. This is setting them up for, we were the victims, they were the perpetrators. There's no gray. There's nothing to navigate. And we are still a set of multi-ethnic societies. And these curricula are essentially time bombs for another round of really serious conflict. But knowing that they weren't able to shift the curriculums, what they managed to do was come together collectively and say, how are we going to teach differently? How are we going to help young people and create, again, quality spaces where people can look at this and say, a Serb soldier isn't only my enemy. Who is this person? What is the space around this, so that I can understand the fullness of the context, rather than just saying they were bad and we were victims and they lost and we won? How do you build that wider space? But how do you also do it at a time when people are still traumatized? How do you create quality spaces where people can lean into that without it re-traumatizing? And they thought really carefully about the kinds of approaches that they would take as teachers. So it wasn't just the content, but it's the quality of the how. And so I really think everywhere we work, it's the quality of those spaces that really stands out to me.
If politics actually becomes a thing for which you are both emotionally and materially invested in, then you are going to actually take steps to act in a way that helps that democracy to thrive, and that helps your fellow person, your fellow neighbor to thrive as well.
What I would say is take pluralism as a tool to get you active in resolving the thing that you care about. Because in a way, pluralism isn't necessarily the thing to care about, it's the thing to use to help make all of these spaces better for everyone. That if we don't have enough resources for, let's talk about healthcare in particular, or enough doctors and nurses in rural areas, there are solutions to that. There's tons of terrific pluralist examples from different parts of the world that say a community-driven approach to mental health that centers mental health as a core foundation for healthy societies actually gets you a lot further than some of our institutionalized questions on mental health. So how can a young person say, I'm going to try to sit down with somebody who thinks about this differently than me? I'm going to seek out all of those different things. And then maybe I'm going to try and pull people together to have that kind of conversation. And one of the things that we're working on in the center is some resources for people to think a little bit about how do you create the quality of that space. And based on some of the examples I gave you and others, we're developing out and testing out a bit about pluralism house rules of what does it look like for you to build that space with others on whatever the issue is and get really engaged.
At the conference, we had this big discussion on it with youth activists, and one guy said, it's all I've got is my voice online. It's my way to make a difference. And that's our failure as a society, that they don't see any other ways to engage. But what's happening is when you take that space, so the person I drove down with almost lost their job. There was a campaign to have them lose their job. She supports her family because of a question she had raised about a policy. And when that happens, it pushes people to those extremes. And from a completely different perspective, I understood that she saw autocracy on the other side. We can't even question policies without being fired. And I don't see that as the reality. And if the government's asking me to say that apples are oranges and oranges are apples, and if I don't say that, I'll lose my job, it's time to take up arms. Like it can push people, right? So cancel culture is very dangerous. And I think we're in a desperate place now where we need to create better ways to engage young people. offline and online.
But I also think there's some really interesting work that's being done on how do you have constructive conversations in the online space. That it doesn't always have to be all toxicity all the time and all yelling all the time. And one of our other Global Pluralism Award laureates from our last cycle is a peace building organization called Build Up. And they did a really interesting exercise where they went into a whole bunch of really vitriolic spaces. And there was one thing that they found that worked. And it was when people were particularly vitriolic, it wasn't telling them that they were wrong or giving them the alternative, sort of the fact sheet or what have you. It was when you leaned in and you said, tell me more. Why do you think what you think? Because all of a sudden, when somebody's listening, you don't have to shout. And it would bring the volume of the conversation down and it would change the quality of it. What I feel is that there are some things that we can all do that aren't actually rocket science to bring this back to the human. I don't think that this is a national thing that comes from on high down to us. I think it is a thing that we all build up. And when I have seen, peace processes around the world, when I have seen success in transformation, it comes people up, right? The revolution in Sudan, people's movements in the Philippines, people up movements are really where it has to start. And so we can't be passive consumers of this. We have to get involved and do things.
We're at a point now where we make a whole slew of assumptions about people on the other side. When I got into the car with my partner in the film, she had raised a question about one political issue. Therefore, I assumed she was also this, she was also that, she also believed this, like a whole slew of things that were actually not true at all. And her questions came from a very valid place in her own experience. And I don't think we convinced each other on anything, but what we did do is see the common humanity and that they're not crazy. She's a really good person, a really kind person. And that's where the friendship started to emerge.
We actually have very complex political views. And for someone who you think might just be like a staunch conservative, or someone who you think might just be like liberal, or someone who you think's like a very aggressive leftist, they actually have very complex, sometimes self-contradictory views on politics. And it would behoove any of us to just continue speaking to that person to see what they actually believe.
I think a change has happened in that now we're identifying ourself with our opinion. So when someone challenges your opinion, they're challenging you, yourself personally. And we are not our opinions, our souls. Our opinions are an act of our mind and the experiences that we've had, not our common humanity at a soul level.
When it comes to conflict, whether it's very real conflict or conflict in deliberation, what we have to understand and what we should always keep at the top of our minds is that we're speaking to other people. We're speaking to other people who we would hope would respect us if the situations were reversed. And in a way, I think that we do this on the day-to-day level, but for some reason, we don't translate it to the political or the political sphere.
We've gotten to a point, I think, where you can become what you're fighting against by closing off to understanding that different life experiences lead to different opinions as well. But if you want diversity of identity, you have to have diversity of opinion as well if you want to avoid authoritarianism and violence. It's as simple as that. I think our biggest challenge in Canada is we take it for granted, the peace, order, stability relative that we seem to have, and it's fragile. But I also go back to under every level of the political language is so polarized, but there are common shared values just below the surface that you tap into. So there was an example of, we talk about creating safe spaces. And on the left, that means to make space for voices that have been excluded from different communities that traditionally didn't have a voice. When you say safe space On the right, that means if I open my mouth, I'm going to be called a racist. It's not a safe space for me at all. So I better just be quiet or I'm going to lose my job. It's that dangerous for me to express my opinion. Whereas at the Braver Angels, coming from a kind of a right side, they'd say, I want a space where I can speak my mind freely and openly. We're talking about exactly the same thing, being able to have a conversation without demonizing each other, but just using because we've reduced it to this lingo. Safe spaces can be alienating, so people don't even come in the door. But underneath, you could see the two sides are talking about exactly the same thing, and on every issue this happens.
And I don't think it's an either or. I can believe really strongly in a position, but I can still want to engage with why the others are feeling the way that they are. Why voters voted the way they did in the United States matters to understand what's happening right now. And there's a poem by Rumi, there's a quote that you may know, which is out beyond ideas of right doing and wrongdoing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. And so when we look at people who have very different opinions on something and spaces that are really polarized, one of the first questions we ask is, don't look for the people that agree with you. Look for the people that are in the field. Look for the people that would willingly step in to that conversation that starts to build understanding of one another. And not everybody will be in the field. Some people are naturally there. I think we could do better at helping our young people learn how to be that in schools. But we can start with a collective group that are in the field.
Can you just share with us a little bit, I guess, about how you see pluralism fitting into sort of our collective governance and the future of Canada, I guess, as we sort of move through these times? Where do you see this going?
Pluralism doesn't need democracy, but democracy needs pluralism to thrive. One of the reasons we're in trouble is that we focused a lot on the democracy piece and not enough on the pluralism underpinnings. And so how do we figure that piece out? How do we say, rather than vilifying one position or another, trying to figure out how you would collectively come to a decision, whether or not it's on legislation on a particular issue or a position on something in relation to foreign policy, something that doesn't satisfy everyone, but that you've had a process by which people have been able to be heard and shape that space and create a bit of a sort of a social fabric that sits underneath the democratic process.
What I always keep in mind is that politics is always about humans. Ethics is always about humans and our relationships to one another before anything else. And I think once we begin to rehumanize people and keep that humanity at the forefront of our political thought, then we enrich our political thought from top to bottom.
Pluralism is not cellular, it is muscular, and we have to exercise it. And right now we haven't been exercising it, right? And so the muscles have atrophied. And so in a way, it's time for all of us to start working on those muscles in all of the different levels of society. And I think that that's what will get us back to a healthier democracy.
Thanks for listening to Democracy Explained. Democracy doesn't just happen, it's something we build together every day. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend, subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, and join us next time as we dive into rights and freedoms. Until then, chat about these ideas with friends, listen to new perspectives, and remember, democracy only works when we all participate. See you then.